I never thought dropping out of college would lead me to uncover something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. My name is Sarah. I'm 23 years old, and up until 8 months ago, I was a junior at Oregon State University studying environmental science. I had decent grades, a solid group of friends, and a future that looked pretty conventional on paper. But something inside me felt hollow, like I was going through the motions of a life that didn't quite fit. My parents were disappointed when I told them I was leaving school. My mom cried, my dad went silent for 3 days, and my younger brother Marcus, who was 17 at the time, told me I was throwing my life away. But I had this nagging feeling that there was something more out there for me, something I couldn't find in lecture halls or textbooks. I'd been having these recurring dreams about my grandmother's old property in rural Montana, a place I'd only visited twice as a kid. The dreams were vivid and strange, showing me walking through overgrown fields and hearing whispers I couldn't quite understand. When my grandmother passed away 2 years earlier, she'd left the property to my mum, but nobody wanted to deal with it. It was too remote, too run down, too much of a project for anyone in our family to take on. The place was located about 40 miles outside of a tiny town called Whitehall, population barely 800 people. The property itself was 90 acres of mostly grassland and forest, with an old farmhouse that hadn't been lived in for nearly 15 years, and a massive red barn that was slowly collapsing under the weight of time and weather. One night, after another argument with my parents about my future, I made a decision that seemed completely insane to everyone around me. I packed up my beat-up Honda Civic with everything I could fit, withdrew the money I'd saved from summer jobs over the years, about $4,000, and drove 21 hours straight to Montana. I didn't tell anyone except my best friend Jessica, who thought I was having some kind of breakdown but promised to cover for me for a few days. The drive gave me a lot of time to think about what I was doing and whether I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Every time doubt crept in, though, I'd remember that hollow feeling, that sense that the path I was on wasn't really mine. I'd think about my grandmother, a woman I barely knew but who had always seemed different from the rest of my family. She'd been a painter and a writer, someone who'd chosen a solitary life in the mountains over the comfortable suburban existence my mom had built. There was something about her choice that resonated with me in a way I couldn't fully explain. When I finally pulled up to the property in early March, it was even more desolate than I remembered. The driveway was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and small trees. The farmhouse looked like something out of a horror movie, with peeling white paint, broken windows, and a front porch that sagged dangerously in the middle. But it was the barn that immediately caught my attention. It stood about 200 feet from the house, a massive structure that must have been magnificent once. The red paint had faded to a rusty pink, and parts of the roof had caved in, but there was something about it that drew me in. I spent the first week just trying to make the farmhouse livable. There was no electricity, no running water, and mice had taken over every room. I bought a generator, some basic camping supplies, and started cleaning. The isolation was intense. My phone barely had signal, and the nearest neighbor was at least 5 miles away. At night, the silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence. I'd lie awake in my sleeping bag, listening to the house creak and settle, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. But during the day, something strange started happening. As I worked on clearing out the house, I kept finding little hints of my grandmother's life here. Paintings stacked in closets, journals filled with her flowing handwriting, photographs of people I didn't recognize. She'd lived a much fuller life than I'd realized. There were pictures of her at art shows, teaching workshops, hiking in the mountains with friends. She hadn't been hiding from the world out here. She'd been building a different kind of world, one that made sense to her. After 2 weeks, I'd made enough progress on the house that I started thinking about the barn. I'd been avoiding it, partly because it looked dangerous and partly because something about it made me uneasy. But one morning, I woke up from another one of those vivid dreams, this time seeing myself inside the barn, finding something hidden beneath the floorboards. The dream felt so real that I could smell the hay and old wood even after I woke up. I decided it was time to explore. I grabbed my flashlight, some work gloves, and a crowbar, thinking I might need to pry open stuck doors. The barn door was massive, probably 10 feet tall, and it took all my strength to slide it open. The hinges screamed in protest, and for a moment I was worried the whole structure might collapse. But it held, and I stepped inside. The interior was cavernous and dim, with shafts of sunlight streaming through holes in the roof. There was old farm equipment scattered around, rusted tools, stacks of rotting hay bales, and years of accumulated debris. Birds had built nests in the rafters, and I could hear them fluttering around above me. The smell was overwhelming at first, a mixture of decay, dust, and something else I couldn't quite identify, something almost metallic. I spent hours that first day just looking around, trying to get a sense of the space. The barn was bigger than I'd realized, with a loft area above and what looked like old animal stalls along one wall. As I explored, I noticed that one section of the floor, near the back corner, looked different from the rest. The boards were newer, or at least less weathered, and they didn't quite match the surrounding wood. My heart started racing as I remembered my dream. I knelt down and examined the boards more closely. They'd been nailed down, but not as securely as the rest of the floor. I wedged my crowbar under one of them and pulled. The board came up easily, revealing a dark space underneath. I pulled up 2 more boards and shined my flashlight into the gap. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. There was a metal box down there, about the size of a small suitcase, covered in dirt and cobwebs. My hands were shaking as I reached down and pulled it up. It was heavy, probably 30 or 40 pounds, and there was a padlock on it that had rusted almost completely through. I carried the metal box out of the barn and into the sunlight, my mind racing with possibilities. What could my grandmother have hidden out here? Why would she bury something under the barn floor? I set it down on the grass and examined it more carefully. The box itself was old, probably military surplus from the look of it, with reinforced corners and a handle on top that had mostly rusted away. The padlock was so corroded that when I hit it with a rock, it crumbled apart like dried clay. My hands trembled as I opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth that had somehow kept everything relatively dry, were stacks of documents, photographs, and what looked like old letters tied together with string. There was also a smaller wooden box, intricately carved with patterns I didn't recognize, and beneath everything, several leather-bound journals that looked ancient. I spent the rest of that day sitting on the porch, going through everything piece by piece. The letters were the first thing I examined, and they were dated from the late 1930s through the mid-1950s. They were written to my grandmother, whose name was Eleanor, from someone named Thomas. The early letters were formal and polite, the kind of correspondence you'd expect between acquaintances, but as I read chronologically, they became more intimate, more passionate. Thomas was clearly in love with my grandmother, but here's where it got complicated. According to my family's history, my grandmother had married my grandfather, a man named Robert Chen, in 1952. They'd had my mother in 1954 and had been married until my grandfather died in 1998. These letters from Thomas, though, continued well into the 1960s, and they weren't the letters of a distant friend. They were love letters, filled with longing and references to stolen moments together and plans for a future that apparently never happened. I felt like I was intruding on something deeply private, but I couldn't stop reading. Thomas wrote beautifully, describing the landscape around Whitehall, the changing seasons, his work as a surveyor mapping the mountain ranges. He wrote about his frustration with the limitations of his time, the expectations that kept them apart. In one letter from 1957, he wrote about seeing Eleanor at a town gathering with her husband and daughter, my infant mother, and how it had broken his heart, but also filled him with a strange joy just to see her happy. The photographs were even more revealing. There were dozens of them, all black and white, showing my grandmother as a young woman with a man who was clearly Thomas. They were together in the mountains, by rivers, in fields of wildflowers. In every photo, they looked radiantly happy. There was one particular image that struck me deeply. It showed them standing in front of this very barn, her head on his shoulder, both of them squinting into the sun with genuine smiles. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, it said, "Our last summer 1951. The journals were the most challenging to read, because my grandmother's handwriting became more cramped and difficult to decipher in the later entries. The earliest journal, from 1948, when she would have been just 20 years old, described her arriving in Montana to teach art at a small school. She wrote about the overwhelming beauty of the landscape, how different it was from Chicago where she'd grown up, and about meeting Thomas at a community dance. Their connection was immediate and intense, but as I continued reading, a darker story emerged. Thomas, it turned out, was married. His wife, Catherine, had been injured in a car accident several years before and required constant care. Thomas was devoted to her, couldn't bring himself to leave her, but he'd also fallen desperately in love with Eleanor. They'd carried on an affair for 3 years, meeting in secret, making plans they both knew were impossible. In 1951, according to the journals, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. This should have been a moment of joy, but the entries from that time were filled with anguish and fear. She wrote about her options, none of them good. She couldn't raise a child alone in that era without facing complete social ostracism. Thomas couldn't leave his wife. The solution they arrived at was heartbreaking. Eleanor left Montana, spent several months in California with a distant cousin, and gave the baby up for adoption. When she returned to Montana 8 months later, Thomas was gone. His wife had passed away, and unable to face Eleanor and what they'd lost, he'd moved to Alaska to work on surveying projects in the wilderness. He wrote to her for years afterward, letters filled with regret and enduring love, but they never saw each other again. In 1952, Eleanor married Robert Chen, a kind man who owned a hardware store in Whitehall. My mother was born 2 years later. I sat there on that porch as the sun set, feeling like my entire understanding of my family had shifted. My grandmother, who I'd always thought of as quiet and conventional, had lived through this epic love story and unimaginable loss. She'd given up a child, carried that secret for decades, and built a life anyway. The property I was sitting on, this isolated place she'd chosen to live, suddenly made more sense. She'd come back to where she'd been happiest, even if that happiness had been complicated and painful. But there was more in the box. The small wooden box contained something I hadn't expected. Inside were legal documents, old adoption papers from 1951, and a birth certificate. The baby had been a girl, born in Los Angeles on September 14, 1951. The adoptive parents were listed as David and Martha Thornton of Sacramento, California. And there was a sealed envelope with, "To my daughter, if she ever finds this," written on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. I didn't open that envelope right away. It felt too sacred, too personal. This wasn't meant for me. But then I realized something that made my stomach flip. If that baby was still alive, she'd be 74 years old now. She'd be my mother's half-sister, my aunt. She might have no idea she was adopted, or she might have spent her whole life wondering about her birth mother. Either way, this box contained answers that someone out there might desperately want. The last journal in the box was from much later, from just 3 years before my grandmother died. In it, she wrote about her decision to document everything and hide it in the barn. She wrote that she'd told my grandfather the truth years into their marriage, and he'd been understanding and supportive. She wrote about her hope that someday her birth daughter might come looking for her, or that someone in the family would find these documents and perhaps track her down. She wrote that her greatest regret was not fighting harder to keep her baby, not being brave enough to face the judgment of the world. And she wrote about Thomas, who had died in Alaska in 1994, never having married again, leaving everything he owned to a wildlife conservation fund. As darkness fell completely, and I sat there surrounded by these remnants of hidden lives and secret sorrows, I realized something profound. I hadn't come to Montana just to escape a life that didn't fit. I'd come to find this. Maybe not consciously, but some part of me had needed to uncover this story. My grandmother's dreams, the ones that had pulled me here, felt less like coincidence and more like inheritance. Hey, if you're still with me on this wild journey, I'd really love it if you could hit that subscribe button. This story is far from over, and I have a feeling things are about to get even more intense. Also, drop a comment below and tell me what you would do if you found something like this. Would you try to find the person? Would you keep the secret? I'm genuinely curious what you all think, because honestly, I'm still figuring out what to do next. Your thoughts might actually help me make this decision. I spent that entire night inside the farmhouse, unable to sleep, reading and rereading the documents by lamplight. Every time I thought I'd processed everything, I'd find another detail that would send my thoughts spinning in a new direction. There were receipts tucked into one of the journals showing that my grandmother had hired a private investigator in 1973 to try to locate her daughter. The investigator's report was brief and discouraging. The Thorntons had moved several times, and the trail had gone cold somewhere in the mid-60s, but there was something else I'd missed on my first pass through the materials. Tucked into the very bottom of the metal box was a small envelope containing a lock of baby hair, so fine and light it was almost translucent, and a tiny hospital bracelet that read, "Baby Girl Thornton." These physical remnants of my grandmother's lost daughter made everything feel suddenly, devastatingly real. This wasn't just a story or a historical curiosity. This was a human being who'd existed, who might still exist, who had no idea that her birth mother had thought about her every single day. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, but wired with purpose. I made coffee on my camp stove and sat down with my laptop, grateful that I'd bought a signal booster the week before that gave me just enough internet to work with. I started searching for any information I could find about David and Martha Thornton of Sacramento, California. It was like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach, especially with such common names. But I had the birth date and location to narrow things down. After 6 hours of searching through genealogy databases, old phone directories, and public records, I finally found something, an obituary from 2008 for Martha Ann Thornton, aged 82, of Boise, Idaho. The obituary mentioned that she was survived by her daughter, Rebecca Thornton Hayes, and 2 grandchildren, Michael and Jennifer. There was no mention of adoption, but the timeline fit perfectly. If this was the right Martha Thornton, then Rebecca would have been born in September of 1951, exactly when my grandmother's daughter was born. My hands were shaking as I searched for Rebecca Thornton Hayes in Boise. I found her almost immediately. She was on Facebook, of all places, with a public profile full of photos of her grandchildren, posts about her garden, and shares from various environmental advocacy groups. She looked exactly like my grandmother. The resemblance was so striking it took my breath away. Same high cheekbones, same warm brown eyes, same way of tilting her head slightly in photographs. There was no question in my mind. This was Eleanor's daughter. But now I faced an impossible decision. Do you reach out to a 74-year-old woman and tell her that everything she might know about her origins is incomplete? Do you risk upending her entire sense of identity? What if she didn't want to know? What if the Thorntons had told her she was adopted, but she'd made peace with it and didn't want her birth family intruding? Or worse, what if she had no idea she was adopted, and learning this information would damage her relationship with the family she'd always known? I called. Jessica, my best friend back in Oregon, the only person who knew where I really was. She picked up on the first ring. "Sarah? Oh my God, are you okay? Your parents are losing their minds. Your mom called me crying yesterday asking if I'd heard from you." "I'm fine, Jess, I promise, but I need to talk through something with you." I spent the next 40 minutes telling her everything I'd found, describing the letters and journals, the photographs, the devastating love story, and now this woman in Boise who was almost certainly my grandmother's daughter. Jessica listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I loved most about her. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, she said, "Sarah, this is huge. Like this could change multiple people's lives. You can't make this decision alone. Have you thought about talking to your mom?" That was the question I'd been avoiding. My mother had always had a complicated relationship with my grandmother. They'd never been particularly close, and after my grandfather died, the distance between them had only grown. My mom had always said that Eleanor was cold, emotionally unavailable, more interested in her art than in her family. Now I understood why. My grandmother had been carrying this enormous grief her entire life, and it had shaped everything about her. "I don't know if I can tell my mom yet," I said. "This might break her. Finding out that she had a sister her whole life that nobody told her about, that her mother had this entire secret history, I don't know if she's ready for that." "But it's not really your secret to keep, is it?" Jessica said gently. "And Sarah, you dropped out of school and drove across the country because something was pulling you there. You found this for a reason. Maybe the reason is that you're supposed to help bring this family back together." After we hung up, I sat on the porch and thought about what Jessica had said. The property around me was starting to come alive with spring. Wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the fields, birds were returning, and the mountains in the distance still had snow on their peaks, but looked less harsh than they had when I'd arrived. My grandmother had loved this place, had chosen to spend her final years here, close to the memories of the only person she'd truly loved and the child she'd lost. I decided to start with the letter my grandmother had written to her daughter, the sealed envelope I'd been afraid to open. I carefully broke the seal and pulled out several pages covered in Eleanor's neat handwriting. It was dated January 10th, 2018, just 6 months before she died. "My dear daughter," it began, "I don't know if you'll ever read this or if anyone will ever find it. But I need to write it anyway, need to tell you the things I should have found the courage to say decades ago. When I gave you up in 1951, I told myself I was doing what was best for you. I was 23 years old, unmarried, and in love with a man I couldn't have. The world wasn't kind to women in my situation. But I've thought about you every single day since then. I've wondered who you became, if you were happy, if you ever thought about me." The letter went on for 8 pages, describing Thomas, describing their love, explaining the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. My grandmother wrote about the pain of carrying her pregnancy in secret, the loneliness of giving birth surrounded by strangers, the agony of holding her baby for just a few hours before signing the adoption papers. She wrote about returning to Montana and trying to build a normal life, about meeting and marrying Robert, about having my mother and trying to be a good wife and mother while carrying this weight of loss. "I wasn't a perfect mother to the daughter I kept," she wrote. "I can see that now. The grief made me distant, made it hard to connect, but I need you to know that my love for you never diminished. You were my first child, my first love as a mother, and letting you go broke something in me that never fully healed. If you're reading this, if someone found these documents and managed to track you down, I want you to know that you were wanted, you were loved, and I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to keep you." The letter ended with practical details, medical history, information about Thomas's family background, and a plea. "If you have children or grandchildren, tell them about Thomas and me. Tell them that sometimes love isn't enough, but it's still real and worth something. Tell them that I thought about you on your birthday every year, imagining what kind of person you might have become. And if you're angry with me, I understand. But know that I did what I thought was right at the time, even though I've spent 67 years regretting it." I sat there with tears streaming down my face, feeling the weight of my grandmother's grief across the decades. This wasn't just an interesting family mystery to solve. These were real people who'd suffered real losses, and the ripples of their choices had affected everyone who came after them. My mother who'd grown up with an emotionally distant mother and never understood why. Me carrying some unnamed inheritance of grief that had maybe pulled me here to set things right. And Rebecca, out there in Boise, possibly having no idea that her birth mother had never stopped loving her. That night, I made my decision. I would try to contact Rebecca, but I would do it carefully, gently, giving her every opportunity to say no. She didn't want to know. This was too much. I would write her a letter, a real physical letter, not an email or a Facebook message. I would explain who I was, what I'd found, and ask her if she'd be willing to talk. If she said no, I'd respect that, but I had to try. I owed it to my grandmother, to Eleanor, who'd carried this hope until the day she died. I spent the next 3 days composing and recomposing the letter, trying to find the right words. How do you tell someone something like this? In the end, I kept it simple and honest. I introduced myself, explained that I was Eleanor Chen's granddaughter, said that I'd found some documents while cleaning out her property, and that I believed Rebecca might be Eleanor's biological daughter. I told her I had letters and photographs if she wanted to see them, but that I understood if this was too overwhelming, if she needed time or didn't want any contact at all. I mailed the letter from the post office in Whitehall, and then there was nothing to do but wait. The postmaster, an elderly woman named Dorothy, who seemed to know everyone within 50 miles, asked me if I was Robert's granddaughter staying out at Eleanor's place. When I confirmed that I was, she smiled sadly. "Your grandmother was a fine woman," she said, "private but kind. She used to come in here every month to mail letters somewhere, never said where. Did that for years." Those letters to Thomas in Alaska, I realized. Even after he'd died, my grandmother had kept writing to him, sending her thoughts out into the void. The idea of it broke my heart all over again. The waiting was excruciating. I threw myself into fixing up the property to keep from obsessively checking the mailbox every hour. I patched holes in the farmhouse roof, replaced broken windows, and even got the well working again, so I had running water. The physical labor was therapeutic, and slowly the place started to feel less like a derelict ruin and more like an actual home. I'd wake up at dawn, work until my muscles ached, and fall asleep exhausted every night with my phone next to my pillow, waiting for a call or email that might never come. 2 weeks after I'd mailed the letter, my mother finally tracked me down. I'd been avoiding her calls, sending occasional texts saying I was fine, but needed some space. But she'd called Jessica, who'd apparently cracked under pressure, and told her where I was. My phone rang at 7 in the morning, and when I saw it was my mum, I knew I couldn't dodge her anymore. "Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, what the hell are you thinking?" Her voice was a mixture of anger, relief, and exhaustion. "You drop out of school, disappear for 2 months, and you think a few text messages are enough? I've been worried sick. Your father wanted to file a missing persons report. I'm sorry, Mom. I really am. But I needed to do this. I needed to figure some things out." I was standing on the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and something about the beauty of it gave me courage. "And I found something here, something about Grandma Eleanor that I think you need to know about." There was a pause. "What are you talking about?" So I told her. I told her about the metal box, the letters, Thomas, the journals, the baby given up for adoption. I told her everything while she stayed silent on the other end. When I finished, the silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Mom, are you still there?" "I'm here." Her voice sounded small, younger somehow. "I don't understand. My mother had another daughter? She gave away a baby? Why wouldn't she tell me? Why wouldn't Dad tell me?" "Grandpa knew. It was in the journals. Grandma told him early in their marriage and he supported her. But I think it was too painful for her to talk about with you. And maybe they thought it would be too confusing, too hard to explain." "Too hard to explain?" Now anger was creeping back into her voice. "Sarah, I grew up thinking I was an only child. I spent my whole childhood wondering why my mother seemed so sad all the time, why she'd disappear into her studio for days and barely talk to anyone. I thought it was my fault, thought I'd disappointed her somehow. And now you're telling me it was because she was grieving a child she gave away before I was even born. I know this is a lot to process. But Mum, there's more. I think I found her. Your half-sister. She lives in Boise, and I sent her a letter 2 weeks ago. Another long silence. Then, you what? Sarah, you had no right. This isn't your story to tell. You should have come to me first. We should have decided together what to do. She was right, of course. I'd been so caught up in the romance of the mystery, in playing detective, that I hadn't fully considered how this would affect the living people involved. You're right. I'm sorry. I should have called you before I did anything. But Mom, I saw her picture. She looks exactly like Grandma. There's no doubt in my mind. My mother was crying now. I could hear it in her voice. What was her name? My mother's other daughter? Rebecca. Rebecca Thornton Hayes. She's 74. She has 2 grown children and grandchildren. She looks happy in her photos, Mom. She looks like she had a good life. Did she respond to your letter? Not yet. It's only been 2 weeks. Maybe she won't respond at all. Maybe this was all a huge mistake. I need to see those documents, my mother said. All of them. I'm coming to Montana. I'll be there in 3 days. After we hung up, I felt both relieved and terrified. I'd set something in motion that I couldn't control, and I had no idea how it would end. I spent those 3 days preparing for my mother's arrival, cleaning up the farmhouse even more, organizing all of Eleanor's documents and letters into a coherent timeline. I also continued working on the barn, and that's when I found the second hidden compartment. I was clearing out the animal stalls, pulling up old rotted wood, when I noticed another section of floor that looked different. This hiding spot was even better concealed than the first, hidden beneath what had once been a feed trough. Inside was a smaller metal box, and when I opened it, I found something that added another layer to the story. It was a collection of paintings, small ones, maybe 8 by 10 inches each, all wrapped carefully in waxed paper. They were Eleanor's work. I recognized her style immediately, but these weren't like any of her other paintings I'd seen. These were intensely personal, almost painfully emotional. One showed a woman holding a baby, both of them rendered in loose, expressive brushstrokes that conveyed overwhelming love and sorrow. Another showed 2 figures standing on a mountain ridge, facing away from the viewer, their bodies leaning toward each other but not quite touching. There were 12 paintings in total, a visual diary of my grandmother's grief and longing. But there was also a letter in this box, and this one was addressed to Thomas. It was never sent, dated 1995, a year after he died. In it, Eleanor wrote about learning of his death, about the regret of never having seen him again, about wishing they'd been braver, made different choices. She wrote about their daughter, about hoping she was out there somewhere living a full and happy life. And she wrote about deciding to stay on this property, in this place where they'd been happiest, because it was the only way she could still feel close to him. When my mother arrived 3 days later, she looked exhausted. The drive from Oregon had taken her 2 full days, and she'd clearly been crying for much of it. She was 51 years old, but in that moment she looked older, worn down by revelations that had shattered her understanding of her own history. We hugged for a long time on the porch, neither of us saying anything, before I led her inside. I'd laid everything out on the kitchen table, organized chronologically. The letters, the journals, the photographs, the adoption papers, the paintings. My mother sat down and started at the beginning, reading every word, studying every image. It took her hours, and I left her alone with it, giving her space to process everything at her own pace. When she finally emerged, it was getting dark. She found me in the barn, where I'd been sanding down some of the old wooden beams, trying to save what could be saved. She loved him so much, my mother said quietly. I never knew my mother was capable of feeling that deeply about anyone. I think that was the problem, I said. She loved him so much that it used up all her emotional energy. There wasn't enough left over for anyone else. That's not fair to me, though. To my father. We deserved better than the leftovers of her heart. But even as my mother said it, I could hear the softness in her voice, the beginning of understanding and forgiveness. No, it wasn't fair, but maybe she did the best she could with what she had left after that kind of loss. I put down my sandpaper and looked at my mother. Did you know she kept painting all those years? Not just the commercial stuff, but these personal, emotional pieces she never showed anyone. She never stopped processing what happened, never stopped grieving. That night, my mother and I sat up late talking about Eleanor in a way we never had before. My mum told me stories I'd never heard, small moments from her childhood that suddenly made more sense in context. How Eleanor would sometimes disappear into her studio for days around September 14th each year, emerging red-eyed and exhausted. How she'd insisted on taking long walks alone every Sunday, always heading toward the mountains. How she'd kept a locked box in her bedroom that she never let anyone look inside. That box, my mother said suddenly. After she died, I looked for it, wanted to see what was so precious she'd kept it locked all those years, but it was gone. She must have buried it out here before she died. That was the first box I found, I said, the one with the letters and journals. She was preparing for this, my mother said slowly. She knew someone would eventually come here and find everything. She wanted the story to be told, but she couldn't bring herself to tell it while she was alive. The next morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after I'd mailed my letter, I got an email. The subject line said, "From Rebecca Hayes," and my heart nearly stopped. My mother and I were having coffee on the porch, and when my phone chimed, we both froze. "Is that?" my mother asked. I nodded, unable to speak, and opened the email. It was short, just a few lines. "Dear Sarah, I received your letter. I've known I was adopted since I was 12 years old. My parents, the Thorntons, were wonderful people who told me the truth when I asked. And I've always known that somewhere out there I had a birth mother who gave me up. I never searched for her because I didn't want to disrupt her life or seem ungrateful to the parents who raised me. But I've thought about her often. If you're willing, I would very much like to see those documents you mentioned. And I would like to meet you and your mother if she's open to it. I have so many questions. Sincerely, Rebecca." My mother was reading over my shoulder, tears streaming down her face. "She wants to meet us," she whispered. "Oh my God, Sarah, she wants to meet us." We arranged to meet Rebecca 2 weeks later, which gave us time to prepare and gave her time to process everything we'd send her. I scanned all the letters, the journals, the photographs, and Eleanor's final letter to her daughter, and emailed them to Rebecca. Then we waited, understanding that she needed time to absorb 67 years of hidden history. During those 2 weeks, something shifted between my mother and me. We worked together on the property, talking about Eleanor in a new light, trying to understand the woman she'd been beneath the cold exterior my mother had always known. We read through the journals together, finding passages that broke our hearts and others that made us laugh. Eleanor had had a wicked sense of humor and a deep appreciation for the absurd that I'd never known about. "I wish I'd known this version of her," my mother said one evening as we sat watching the sunset from the porch. "The woman who wrote these journals, who loved so fiercely, who had dreams and passions. All I ever saw was someone who was barely there." "Maybe she couldn't show you that person because it hurt too much," I said. "Every time she looked at you, she probably thought about the daughter she'd given away. You were a reminder of everything she'd lost." "That's a hell of a burden to carry," my mother said, "for both of us." Rebecca emailed us 3 days before we were scheduled to meet. She'd read everything, she said, multiple times. She'd cried until she had no tears left. She'd learned that her birth father was a surveyor named Thomas, who'd never stopped loving Eleanor, and that their love story was both beautiful and tragic. She'd learned that Eleanor had thought about her every day, had hired investigators to try to find her, had carried that grief until her dying day. And she wanted us to know that she didn't harbor any resentment, that she understood the impossible situation Eleanor had been in, and that she was grateful for the life the Thorntons had given her. We decided to meet at the property, at Eleanor's farmhouse, because it felt right somehow. This was where the story had begun, where Thomas and Eleanor had fallen in love, where their daughter had been conceived, and where Eleanor had eventually returned to live out her final years. It seemed fitting that this was where the family would finally come back together. Rebecca arrived on a Saturday morning in late May. The property was beautiful by then, with wildflowers everywhere and the mountains sharp and clear against the blue sky. I saw her car coming down the long driveway, and my stomach clenched with nervousness. What if this was a mistake? What if bringing everyone together just caused more pain? But then she stepped out of the car and all my doubts evaporated. She was tall and elegant, with Eleanor's face and Thomas's kind eyes. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a box under one arm. My mother and I walked down from the porch to meet her, and for a moment, we all just stood there, 3 generations of women connected by secrets and DNA and loss. Rebecca spoke first. "You must be Sarah," she said to me, her voice warm. "And you're Michelle." She turned to my mother, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. "My sister. I have a sister." They embraced, these 2 women who shared a mother but had lived completely separate lives, and I stepped back to give them space. They held on to each other for a long time, crying and laughing and saying things too soft for me to hear. When they finally pulled apart, Rebecca wiped her eyes and smiled. "I brought something," she said, holding up the box. "I want to show you both." We went inside, and Rebecca opened the box on the kitchen table. Inside were her own collection of documents and photographs. The Thorntons, it turned out, had saved everything from her adoption, including letters they'd exchanged with the agency, and a photograph they'd been given of Eleanor. It was taken when Eleanor was pregnant, probably around 7 months, and she was standing in front of this very farmhouse, one hand on her belly, looking directly at the camera with an expression of fierce determination mixed with sorrow. "My mother, Martha Thornton, gave me this picture when I was 18, Rebecca said. She told me that the agency had provided it so I'd have something of my birth mother. Martha said I should know that I came from someone strong, someone who'd made an impossible choice out of love. We spent the entire day together, the 3 of us, sharing stories and filling in gaps. Rebecca told us about her life, about growing up in Sacramento and then Boise, about her career as a middle school science teacher, about her 2 children and 4 grandchildren. She told us that she'd had a good life, that the Thorntons had been wonderful parents, but that there had always been a part of her that wondered about the woman who'd given birth to her. My mother told Rebecca about growing up with Eleanor, about the distance and the coldness, and about finally understanding where it came from. She apologized, which seemed strange at first, but she explained that she felt the need to apologize on Eleanor's behalf for the choice that had separated them. Rebecca stopped her gently. "Your mother made the only choice she could," Rebecca said. "I don't resent her for it. How could I? She gave me life, and then she gave me to people who could give me the stability and love she couldn't provide at that time." As the afternoon wore on, I showed Rebecca the barn and the place where I'd found the metal box. She stood there for a long time, running her hands over the old wooden beams, breathing in the scent of hay and history. "She thought about me here," Rebecca said quietly. "Every time she came into this barn, she thought about me. Every day," I confirmed. "It's in the journals. September 14th, your birthday, she'd spend the whole day out here painting or just sitting, remembering." Rebecca turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for finding all of this, for having the courage to reach out. You could have just kept it all to yourself or thrown it away, but you didn't. You gave me my history." That evening, as the sun began to set, we walked together to the spot where Thomas and Eleanor had been photographed, the place behind the barn where they'd stood with her head on his shoulder. The field was full of the same wildflowers that had been there in the old photograph, purple lupine and yellow balsam root. We stood there together, 3 generations connected by a love story that had spanned decades and shaped all of our lives in ways we were only beginning to understand. "I've been thinking," my mother said as we stood there, "about this property, about what to do with it. Sarah, you've done an incredible job fixing it up, making it livable again. And Rebecca, this is part of your history too, even if you never knew it. What if we kept it in the family? What if we made it a place where all of us could come, where we could stay connected? Rebecca smiled. I'd like that. I'd like my grandchildren to know this place, to know the story of Eleanor and Thomas. Not the sanitized version, but the real story, with all its complexity and pain and beauty. And I'm going to stay, I said, surprising even myself with the declaration. I'm going to finish fixing up the house and the barn. I'll figure out the rest as I go, but this is where I need to be right now. My mother looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something like respect mixed with understanding. Your grandmother would be proud of you, she said. You came here looking for something, and you found it. But more than that, you gave all of us something we didn't even know we were missing. We stayed until the stars came out, talking and laughing and planning future visits. Rebecca promised to come back in August with her children, who were eager to meet their newfound aunt and cousin. My mother said she'd take a leave of absence from her job and spend the summer helping me with the property. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself, connected to a history that was messy and complicated, but also beautiful. Before she left the next morning, Rebecca stood in front of Eleanor's paintings, the personal ones I'd found hidden in the barn. She studied the one of the mother holding the baby for a long time. "Can I have this one?" she asked. "I know they should probably stay with the family, but this one, I feel like it was meant for me." "It was," my mother said. "Take it. Take anything you want. This is your mother's legacy too." As I watched Rebecca drive away, her car disappearing down the long driveway, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. I'd dropped out of college on a hunch, following dreams I didn't understand, and I'd uncovered a story that had changed everything. I'd found Eleanor's hidden truth, and in doing so, I'd found something for myself too. I'd found purpose, connection, and a sense of belonging I'd never felt before. The property around me was waking up to summer. The mountains were green, the sky was impossibly blue, and somewhere out there, Thomas and Eleanor's love story was finally complete. Not the ending they'd hoped for, where they grew old together, but an ending nonetheless. Their daughter knew she was loved. Their secret was no longer buried, and their story would be told to future generations, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the enduring power of love, even when circumstances make it impossible. I spent that afternoon working on the barn, securing loose beams and patching holes in the roof. The work was hard and satisfying, and as I labored, I thought about all the hands that had touched this wood before mine. Thomas building something that would last, Eleanor hiding her secrets in the floorboards, and now me trying to preserve it all for whatever came next. That night I sat on the porch with a glass of wine and my grandmother's journals, reading by lamplight. I'd read them all before, but now I was looking for something different. I was looking for advice, for guidance about what to do with my own life now that I'd completed this unexpected quest. And there, in a journal from 1987, I found a passage that felt like it was written directly to me. "I've spent so much of my life living in the past," Eleanor had written, "mourning what I lost, regretting the choices I made. But lately, I've been thinking that maybe that's not the only way to honor what Thomas and I had. Maybe the real way to honor it is to live fully in the present, to embrace whatever time I have left and fill it with the same passion and intensity we once shared. The love was real. The loss was real. But my life is still real too, and I owe it to myself and to everyone I've loved to actually live it." I closed the journal and looked out at the mountains, dark shapes against the star-filled sky. I'd come here running from a life that didn't fit, and I'd found something unexpected. Not just a family secret or a forgotten love story, but a template for how to live authentically, even when it's hard, even when the world doesn't understand. Eleanor had hidden her truth because she had to, because her time demanded it. But she'd also preserved it, ensured it would be found, because she understood that truth matters, that love matters, even across decades and beyond death. I pulled out my phone and opened a blank note, starting to write down ideas. If I was going to stay here, really stay, I needed a plan. Maybe I could finish my degree online, focusing on environmental conservation, and use this property as a base for studying the local ecosystem. Maybe I could turn part of the barn into a studio and start painting like Eleanor had. Maybe I could just work on the land, restore it, and see what grew from there. The possibilities felt endless, and for the first time since I'd left college, the future felt like something I was moving toward instead of running from. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this entire journey. If this story moved you in any way, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd hit that subscribe button and become part of this community. I think all of us are searching for connection, for meaning, for the courage to live authentically even when it's hard. That's what Eleanor and Thomas's story taught me, and that's what I hope to keep exploring here. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed how you understood your own history? What would you do if you found something like this? And here's the big question. What did you learn from Eleanor's story? For me, it was that love and loss can coexist, that grief doesn't have to define us, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is tell the truth, even when it's decades late. Share your thoughts, your stories, your reactions. This community is about more than just watching videos. It's about connecting over the things that make us human. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's struggling with their own path or carrying their own secrets, please share this with them. Sometimes we all need to be reminded that it's never too late to uncover the truth, to heal old wounds, and to start living the life we're meant to live. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.